the introductions to this important conversation. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to hear Professor Xu as well as to speak to this group. I'm going to try to share my screen, and we'll see if the technology gods are blessing us today. Now I need to come out and realize that I am not at the beginning of my. So we've been asked to think about what the future holds for all of us as citizens of the world, and then what the implications are for education. And I'm thinking about this in the context of what we think of as a need for transformation, rather than the kinds of reforms that we may have seen over the recent years. All of us are very much aware we've experienced a public health crisis, an economic crisis, a climate crisis, a civil rights crisis in the United States and in many other parts of the world, all inequalities in our societies and education systems, and the disparities between what education needs to be and what it has been. And when we have these kinds of very disruptive moments in human history, they often lead to large, substantial generational social change, including in the area of education. We all know that prior to the pandemic, the demand for skills was changing faster than many education systems have been able to respond, with demand for complex skills going up and the demand for routine skills going down. The dilemma of schools has often been that the skills that are the easiest to teach and test are also the ones that are the easiest to digitize and automate and outsource. And that digitization, that uses of technology is increasing at a very, very rapid pace. In 1970, we thought about the major skills of schooling that businesses would need, being reading, writing, and arithmetic. By the turn of the century, the top skills that were demanded by business were teamwork, problem solving, interpersonal skills, and oral communications. Those are rapidly continuing to increase, along with creative thinking and the need to be able to be self-motivated and to be self-managing in many, many business contexts. The other thing that's been happening is that knowledge has been growing. And between 1999 and 2003, there was more new knowledge created in the world than in the entire history of the world preceding. You think about what that means. In recent years, technology knowledge has been doubling more than once a year. About every 10 or 11 months, we have doubled the amount of technology knowledge. What does that mean for school? It means that where we might have thought at one time that we could identify the knowledge that is needed and divide it up into the 12 years of schooling, and then, give that knowledge to students and ask them to demonstrate that they know it on examinations in which they, give back the information that they have been receiving. Our students are now going to have to work with knowledge that hasn't been discovered yet, using technologies that have not been invented yet, and solving major global problems that we have not managed to solve. And when I think about what's demanded in this new environment that we're in, I think about Google, which is right up the street from me. I live in Silicon Valley. And for many years, this large, growing corporation used the kinds of evidence from traditional school transcripts, test scores, grade point averages, and other things like that to select employees. They did a major study to find out which of those elements was the biggest predictor of success at Google. And they found out that none of those traditional school measures predicted success in this kind of industry. In fact, what was predictive was what they came to call learning ability. Learning ability is really the ability to find, resources, to have a problem, to find and use resources, to integrate those resources, to analyze them, to develop solutions in partnership with others, collaborating to figure out new solutions, testing those, planning and implementing, and then testing those solutions, self-managing the process to improve the outcome, and ultimately being able to learn on a constant basis. So that really is the quintessential foundational element for education in this century that we need to develop for the century to come. There are a number of ongoing challenges that the current pace of change and the current context for education pose to educators around the world. One is that we need new knowledge and skills that require some changes to schools, the curriculum that will build learning ability, attention to social and emotional learning, which I'll talk about in a moment, which turns out to be tightly integrated with academic learning. We need assessments that support problem solving and agency, not just the memorization of information. We need the development of applied skills for this new age where students know what to do with that knowledge and how to apply what they're learning in novel situations. And there's a huge demand for equity all around the world where more and more students get access to the kinds of learning that we used to restrict to a very small number. So the question for us, I think, is how we use this moment of disruption that the pandemic has created, of all of the other challenges that we're experiencing to support systemic change. The organization that I'm involved with, the Learning Policy Institute, which exists to take research about learning, how we learn, how we organize successful learning, and bring it into the policy arena. We developed a synthesis of that research when the pandemic was just beginning on restarting and reinventing school to meet what we know. And why we talk about reinventing is because in many countries, current schools were designed 100 years ago, and they were not designed to support what we know now matters. Strong relationships, a whole child approach to learning, these kinds of deeper learning skills that are demanded in the 21st century, the personalized supports that we now know are needed, and the equitable opportunities for achievement that are essential in this current age. So we think about reinventing school as really focusing on authentic learning and equity and harnessing a vast body of knowledge of human development, learning, and effective teaching that's been accumulated over the last century and needed for the next. And when we think about what is that science of learning and development, what is that knowledge base? There's been a lot of advances in recent years, some of them published in the Applied Developmental Science Journal, synthesizing what we know from neuroscience, developmental science, learning sciences, anthropology, sociology, about the nature of the brain, about the drivers of human development, and about the implications for practice of these understandings from the science of learning and development. That last article, which I led with a team and published a couple of years ago, has been read more than 900,000 times on the web, which is it gives you a sense of how much interest there is now to understand how to apply that body of knowledge to education. The brain basis for integrating social, emotional, and academic development is one of the results of synthesizing what we know. So let me, in a nutshell, just describe some of these principles from the science of learning and development. The first thing we know is that the brain is always developing, even at my age, as a product of relationships and experiences. It's not that you have a set capacity when you're born, and that's the end of it, and you can be categorized and educated accordingly. It's the brain is very plastic. As we've seen, when people have strokes or other injuries to the brain, you can rewire the brain. And that the relationships and the experiences that we create matter greatly. That's what schools are all about. We know that learning is social, emotional, as well as academic, that if you feel good about an environment, if you feel that you are in a trusted space and are viewed as competent, if you feel positively about the people in that space and about the tasks that are there for you to do, you learn more effectively. If you are distressed, if you've been traumatized, if you are stigmatized, it actually impedes the learning process. It clouds the brain, it distracts the brain, it makes it more difficult to learn. We know that children are always actively constructing the knowledge that they own by connecting what they know to what they're learning, and we all do that within our cultural contexts. So understanding those cultural contexts is extremely important. We know that students' perceptions of their own ability influence learning. And so how we think in schools about labeling students and grouping students actually has an independent effect on the learning process. We know that trauma and adversity affect the brain. They affect the brain architecture and the learning process. And we also know that relationships are the most important antidote to trauma, and they are key for healing. And finally, we know that a child's best performance occurs under conditions of low threat with high support in settings where they feel accepted, respected, and enabled. So there are many implications for the learning context of what we know now about the learning process. The implications of this are also different than what we thought was the case when current systems were created. We used to think that genes drive whom we become, and that you could identify a student as, smart or average or dumb at the beginning of their life and put them in a track or a lane, and that would be a way to appropriately educate them. We now know that context is the primary driver of whom we become. In fact, only 10% of our genes are ever expressed, and the ones that are expressed are the ones that the context enables us to express. We know that talent is not scarce, that it is plentiful, and it does not array on a single dimension on a bell curve. We used to think that average stands for the individual and you could teach to the average. But in fact, average almost never represents an individual. Individual brains are completely differently constructed and wired. There's a very interesting set of studies about that, and that individuals really are on a unique path. And while there are commonalities, there are also important ways in which we need to be, where our education needs to be personalized for the ways in which we are learning and developing. We used to think that the factory model would be the modern way to educate children back in the days when Henry Ford was creating the first assembly line. But we now know that agency engagement are what really support deeper learning, and that potential is visible in environments that are designed to reveal it. So the kinds of schools that are needed look very different from the, every child doing their own thing in a desk where they're responding to a set of predetermined questions, and look much more like these environments where students are engaged in inquiry, collaborating in the process, supported by the educator who is enabling them to ask and answer questions and learn how to learn. One of the other features of the environment is that if it's going to be successful, it needs to be much less rooted in the production of cortisol, which is the hormone that floods the brain with adrenaline and creates the fight or flight syndrome when we experience stress, and actually impedes the cognitive wiring of the brain as well as the learning process, and much more productive of oxytocin, what I think of as the hugging hormone, whether it's virtual or physical, because that in fact floods the brain in a way that promotes brain architecture, promotes the connections of neurons, and creates the environment in which learning is much more possible. One of the things that we've done in this work on the science of learning and development is to really develop a set of principles for what schools ought to be attending to. design principles for environments that really do take advantage of the way in which healthy learning and development occur. That means creating environments that are full of positive developmental relationships, which allow students to be well known and well supported over time. Those relationships also extend to the ways in which educators work with each other and with families. We know that environments need to be designed to be full of safety, physical and psychological safety, and a sense of belonging, which in fact supports the ability to take risks in the learning process. We know that the learning experiences need to be rich and inquiry-oriented with the right blend of inquiry and direct instruction to develop knowledge that is really analytic and higher order thinking skills oriented. We know that we need to explicitly develop the skills, habits, and mindsets that allow for social and emotional stability and management, which then allows people to be successful in school and in life, including such things as a growth mindset, including the kinds of habits that allow students to develop resilience and perseverance, the ability to work with each other. And we also know that we need those support systems when students experience obstacles, whether those are obstacles in the home or obstacles in the community or obstacles to their learning in school, that immediately address their needs so that they can move forward. This requires us to think about some shifts in schooling from more impersonal structures to much more relationship-centered designs. And we've got many, many studies of schools that have made these shifts and get extraordinary outcomes that are much more equitable and also allow a much higher performance. It means shifts from lists of rules that determine who gets excluded from school to the development of classroom communities with that explicit teaching of responsibility and collaboration and the habits and mindsets that allow that community to be productive and supportive. Moving from transmission teaching to active and inquiry-based learning, not just getting through the book, but really deeply inquiring into questions and problems that matter. A pedagogy that goes beyond, teach, give a chapter, give a test, give a grade, to one that really is much more focused on mastery learning, where there's support and feedback as students are engaged in performances, and then the opportunity to revise and redo the work so that, in fact, confidence and competence are always increasing. And we see extraordinary outcomes when that approach to learning is implemented. It means moving beyond tests that are used to rank and sort and select toward the kinds of assessments, performance tasks that actually develop abilities even as they assess and evaluate those abilities. It means moving towards inclusive classrooms and schools as hubs of families and communities. And where we see those coming together, we see, as I say, very much different outcomes than in the systems that were much more individualistic and competitive in their orientation. What are the elements of systemic progress at scale? Well, one of the things we know when we look across the world is that high-performing countries combine quality with equity. This upper right-hand quadrant, this comes from an OECD graph, shows a number of countries with high achievement in mathematics and high investments in equity, where resources are going to the schools and students who need them the most. The upper left-hand quadrant are countries that are high achievers but low on equity. And you can notice that that's an empty set. It really is not possible to achieve high performance without attention to equity. The other thing that we know about building these systems is that high-performing countries think and act systemically about the development of teaching. We did a study a few years ago called Empowered Educators about education in 5 countries that support teaching or jurisdictions that do, and it included Canada, Singapore, Finland, two of the states in Australia, and Shanghai, China. And what we found is that the ways in which the country or the state or province thought about preparing teachers was connected to the goals they had for curriculum and assessment. They funded schools in ways that supported that. They recruited, prepared, inducted, and supported learning and appraisal of practice in very coherent ways that are mutually reinforcement and created structures, including leadership development and career development, where teachers could become more skilled as senior teachers or master teachers in ways that then allowed them to be part of the mentoring and support for others to maintain this coherent approach to continually improving teaching. And we've also found that when you have a whole child approach, where resources are aimed at pupils' needs, where the curriculum and assessment are explicitly geared to the higher order skills that I described at the beginning, and teachers and leaders are organized to support that curriculum, wraparound supports are available, and we begin with the early childhood on-ramp, that we get, again, a very different set of outcomes, much more equitably distributed. The big policy shifts associated with that kind of educational context include the nature of the curriculum and assessment, smart uses of technology for collaborating and for inquiry, as well as individualizing work, very much more relationship-centered school designs that may have advisory systems, looping designs, teams of teachers working with groups of students whom they share and with whom there is a counseling connection to the students and families, investments in social emotional learning, and those student supports that remove obstacles. Key in everything is educator preparation for all of the above, because teaching is the profession on which all other professions depend. It is the way by which we accomplish these other goals. When we think of the road ahead, I want to just quote a parent who was interviewed at the beginning of the pandemic about what should happen in schools. And she said, reprioritize. This is the time to see if something can be different. To reset the system, we have to take a loss, but we can recoup the loss if we actually get kids excited about education and create a more positive space for them to learn. And with that, I want to hand the ball to my colleague who will help us understand how this looks on the ground in the work that he has been doing.
我想讲4个问题，4个问题呢，实际上是3个大的问题。第一个问题叫我们赖以生存的环境。
Four things I want to cover. First, the environment that we live in is going through a crisis, which is very similar to what Linda talked about. And the second is the disruptive world we're living in, especially for education. And the third is how education can adapt to disruptive changes, so education reform. And the last would be the experiment that we conduct and some of the thoughts that we've gathered. We'll start with the first one, the environment that we live in terms of how it is changing. So, four things. First, the Earth faces threats. We know that UNESCO in 2021 just issued a very important document about reconstructing our future, which mentioned the future of mankind depends on the future of the earth, and both live in grave danger today. The eco footprints show on that we need 16 Earths to support our lifestyle if it remains unchanged in the future. We have very little time left on before the Paris Agreement goal. And second is about the pandemic. 7 years
会改可
ago,
能
Bill
比
Gates
战争更危险的
predicted
是
that
病毒。
what
那么其实
would
从
be more
2020
dangerous
年
than
前年
war
开
could
始，
be
那么病毒到现在一直
virus.
在影响着
Unfortunately,
整
his
个的地球，
concern
整个的
has
世
been
界，
proven
现在这种
true
变异
in
株
the
还在不
beginning of
断的出现，
2020, and new
从这个比如
strains
BA.5.2、
still
BA.7、
emerge
到小
and
北北，
from
到北cực翼。
BA
那么现在，
5.2
那
to
么
BQ
病毒到
.1.
底能不能到
As to
看到头了？其
whether
实
a
未必，
virus
有人认
uh,
为可能更大的灾
is
难还来
going
临，这
to
是我们应该去关
be
注的。
the
所
biggest
以，生命教
catastrophe.
育的问题，
And
刚
that
刚这个戴
remains
大
to
卫
be
先生也
a
讲
open
到，就是
question.
咱
And
们国家
as
必
the
须对
previous
这生
speakers
命教育的问
mentioned,
题高度的关注。
the
其
Yiping
实，
Foundation really
在
cares
教育
about
过程中，我
life
觉得我们对这个问
education.
题
I
也
think
越
in the
来越
process
有
of
意识和
education
重视。
reform,
第
we
三
are
呢，国
not
家处在
given
一个
uh,
对立之中。
such
我们知
topics
道，
enough
这个
attention yet.
整个世界
Third
的这
is
样一种对立啊，其实这些年来一
countries
直
and
在增
confrontation.
长，习近平总书记
Confrontation
也专
has
门指
grown
出，
in past
中
few
无论
decades.
是
President Xi
地区
Jinping
的
also
这
mentioned
个
given
冲
to
突，无论是
regional
巴天主义宣传政策，
conflicts,
新冠都在不断的上升。
hegemony,
所以，这个虽
unilateralism,
然我
such
们知道有核
negative
安全公
trends
约，但是
have been
从二
witnessed
次
to
大
be
战
on
以
the
来，
rise
说老实话，核安
since
全的
the
问题一
Second
直没
World
有停
War.
止威胁。所
Nuclear
以，怎
has
么
always
从
remained a
这个
threat to
加
the
强
peace
国
and
际理解的
development
教
in
育，也
mankind,
是
or
一个
how to
非常关键的问
increase
题。第四
international
呢，就是
understanding.
关于
Education is
技术，就
also
在
very
扩张之
important.
中。
The fourth would be
我
the
们知道，美国的学者波兹曼他
expanding
曾经
technologies.
把这个文明分成3类，
A
也就是说，
new
工具运用文
Potsman
明、技术组织文明
categorized
和技术垄断文明。
civilization
那么
into
在第一
three
类的文明中
types:
呢，技术呢主要是作为一个
tools,
中介的工具，人们借
technologies,
助于技术呢来
and
认识世界、
a
改造世
monopoly
界，
of
从而创造了世界文
technologies.
明。
And
但
the
是在后
first
两种文
type
明
of
中，
civilization
技术呢
technologies
它
are
从工
used
具的利
as the
用呢走向了一种
intermediaries
统治的
for
地
the
位，
mankind
甚
to
至于是
understand
一个
it
垄断的
and
地
to
位，
create a
成为中立
world.
化的控制
And
地位。
that's how
所以
world
技术本来应该
civilization
是为
was
人
created.
类
But for the
自由解放而
latter
战
two
胜而
types
起，而
technologies
成为了奴役人们的
can
工具。所以现在社
rule
会我们知道各
or
种
even
互联网、人工
dominate
智能、
the
数据、
world,
区
and
块
they
链一系列
become
的技术 日
a
新月异的发展，
controlling
包括我们这
power.
一次论
And
坛讨
in
论的元宇
these
宙。
two types of the
但
world, and
是
the
技
humans
术的扩
are
张
not
同样带
deliberated
来
by
一
the
个很重
technologists,
要的
but
新的问题，
rather
也就是说，
potentially be
等到我们
enslaved
这个
by
技
technology.
术
So here
变成人类
we
不
have
可
a
控的
new
时候，我们
question,
的社会会发
which
生什
is
么样的
when
变化？
technologies
所以
go
新的
out
文
of
明
control,
教育
what
应该
will the
说也
world
是人
be
手大脚。
like? And that is why
那么第二个
we
问题呢，简
have
单说一下，
very
其实
heavy
我们的时代处在
responsibilities
蜕变之中，
to understand
其
how to
实说我们的时
grasp
代处在蜕
and
变之
to
中，其实
seize
也可以把它说
opportunities
是我们的
brought
教育
by
处在
technologies in a
蜕变
way
之中，因为
so
这些都
that
是教
the
育
world
这个
can
发生
remain
发展的
productive
变革的一个
while
非常重要的一个
sustainable. And
背
the
景，
second
第一就
chapter
是
of
刚
my
刚这个
topic is
领导人
the
提到的，
disruptive
就是
changes
社会
that
信息
we
的膨胀化。
are immersed
这个
in. We
膨胀
already
化，
talked
这或者
about
领域
how
性质的数据啊，应该说
information
的确是
has been grown
历史上从未有过。
exponentially, and
我们
indeed
进入
this is
30年来，
unprecedented
人类创
in
造的信
human
息比
history.
过去
And the
5000年生
information
产的信
created
息
in the
都要
past
来得多。
3 decades
近
already
10年信息的
exceeded
创造
the
方面比
total
过去2000年的时
amount
候来得
created
多。
in the past
所以
5,000 years,
随着
and
这样一种
what
新
was
的变
created in
化，
the
那
past
么人
one
类
decade exceeded what
怎么样去
was
下
created in
语
past
这些知识和
2,000
信
years,
息，
but how to
人类
really
在被大量的
rein
垃圾信息
the
所淹没的情况
universe
下，
of
怎么样能够更好的
information
生存，
and how
怎
not
么
to
样
be
防止信
drowned
息在
in
摄取知识，
the ocean of
在这个信息中摄取知
information
识，在
that
知
is
识中失去智
growing
慧，
so
陷入一
on
种知识无智慧的这样一种
rapidly,
境
and
地，的确也
we
是我们将来应该
really
思考的问题。所
need
以
to
现在教育方式为什么
rethink
要
these
被认
questions,
为接受
and
记
that
忆，
is why we need to
来
change from
让
a
主动的
passive
去
route
学习
learning to
构建，我觉得这个
agency-based,
信息社会
active
本身的变化影响的关系。
redesigning and
第二呢，教育
reconstructing
资
of
源的泛
knowledge
在
and
化。
information that are already
学校呢不
presented
再
to
是教学知识的
learners.
唯一场
And the
所，
second would
知
be
识
the
不再是学少
panel
数人拥
systems
有
of
的东西，
education
随时随地线上
resources.
线下现在处处
Resources
都可以
are
获得知识。
not
所
only
以有
accessible
人也
in
提出
schools or
在学校
certain
存在的必
premises,
要
and
性，
knowledge
或
is
者说存在
not
学校存
a
在实时的
novelty that
新
is
的变
owned by
它这也是世俗
minority
边缘。
in
第
the
四呢，第四呢
world.
就是
It is
旅游是一个
there
快手。
anytime,
我们知道
anywhere, online,
整个
offline,
的学校教
everyone,
育都是为职
everywhere
业准备。
it
但
can
是
access
现在
knowledge.
呢，
And
学校
third
教
would
育
be
已经无
rapid
法为这
changes
些
of
需求
occupation.
准
Well,
备。
right now,
那
school
在
education
西方发
is
达国
no
家，大概一
longer
个人一生
preparing the
学
learners
上的
through
免
the
职
future. In Western countries, one person has about, on average, 10 opportunities to change his or her career path in a lifetime. And in the past, school education was always focused on how to align what one learns to what one works on in on his or her future career, but that's no longer the relevance. And next is about empowerment of technologies. Well, internet, artificial intelligence, blockchain, and the big data are really empowering education. Elon Musk has already embedded the chips or implanted chips in human brains. Well, how do we outsource recognition so that our learning capacity can be enhanced? The traditional education or pedagogy was based on the representation of knowledge and role learning, and that has to change. And the education minister of China, Mr. Huan Jinpeng, advocates that digitalization should be leveraged to initiate global education and reform. We need to seize opportunities of the digital age and to concentrate the digital educate resources on co-sharing and for education inclusivity and new breakthroughs of quality-driven education, a transformation. And next is normalization of lifelong learning. Well, in the past, education was finished in one go, from K to 12 and after. And then the last milestone of one's diploma, there is no learning left, but now it's from cradle to grave, and also the ways and means that we learn also are different. We have intermittent learning, learning on the job, and learning through the job, and so on and so forth. So in the future, I think intermittent and fragmented learning will be the new norm, including diploma. And I often say that diploma in the future will no longer be as relevant as the capacities one actually grasps through the general process of learning. And next, personalization of the content of learning. Well, in the past, everything was made in an industrial manner. Personalization was very much borderline, and learners had very few choices. In the future, they will have more choices, more personalized needs will be satisfied, and different cohorts of the learners can actually choose a certain pedagogy and a certain type of content that is customized to them. Well, that requires transformation, which brings me to the third chapter of my speech. Well, Edwin, the UNESCO's Director General, also said we need to reconstruct the connections between humans and the earth. And the transformation education involves a lot of factors, but I want to focus on four things. First is from human-centric to ecocentric. In the past, education focused on mankind. We believe that mankind was the most important existence in the world, but we know climate change, as I mentioned, is really profoundly affecting the ecosystem of the earth. In the future, it will continue to affect lives on earth. In this context, education must not shy away from the relationships that humans have with other lives on earth. And I think we really need to shift our mindset to a broader horizon. And many governments are actually positioning digital literacy and social, emotional literacy and green literacy, as well as recognition or recognitive literacy as the four passports for future society. So in the education process, how to really value environment and ecosystem should be a very essential direction for future education. And next is the focus from scores to life. Students used to be utensils that passively accept and receive knowledge and machines for exams. And in the academic world, there was only knowledge but no life. But the the
所以在这个时
pandemic
候，
is
实际上是
exposing
加强我们
how
生命
life
教育是非
education
常重
is
要的。
absent
这是我
in
最
the
近
current
在商务印
system.
书馆出版的一本《脱单
I
生
just
命的长
published
宽
this
高》。
book
那
on which is
这个
about
提出
which
了
is
我们生命
called
教育、新教育和
extending
生命教育的
the
需要。我觉得
dimensions,
这
the
个
length of
我
wisdom
们的
and
教育
also the
要
depth
引导
of
学生欣赏
life.
本来自己
We
的发展
need
历程，
to
要珍惜生命的
guide
存在，
students to
期盼生命
appreciate
的美好，
themselves
体
and the
会生
life
命的
of
意义，
others,
并
to
且能够
cherish
把
the
这种生
existence
命的
of
关
life,
怀和热
to
爱呢惠
expect
及
the
他人，
beauty of life,
自然
to
具有人文
perceive
关
the
怀、
meaning of life,
拥抱
and
命
so
题的
that
舒
their
服和
care and
宽广
passion
的
of
这
the
样的
life
人
can
类群
really
体。
be extended to
这
others'
个
nature and to have the
第
humanistic
三呢，是
care
从
and
民
to the
粹主义走
inclusivity
向地球主
towards
义。
and for
那
a
我们知
better
道，这也是一
world.
个目前
And
世界
next is from
比较严重的
populism
问题。
to
世界上的仇恨为什么越来
a
越多，
global
往往
world.
跟
I think the
狭隘
increasing
的这样
conflicts
一个民粹
that
主
we
义有关
witness
系。
are
那
often
我们每个
connected
人既
to
有
the
自己的家
narrow
乡和土地，这是我
populism.
们的根，是我
Everyone,
们的归
of
属。
course, has
但是
its
我们有一
own
个更大的家乡
motherland
和土地，
and
有一个
home,
更深的理念，有一个更加高远的归属，
and
这
also
是我们的
home.
地球。
But what is
现
more
在社会呢，整
fundamentally
个的交通通
recognized
信也
as
会
our
变得越来越
homeland
便
should
利，
be
经济的人
Earth
口呢也越来
now.
越紧密。
And
地球呢
transportation
已经
and
成为一个真正
communication
意义
are
上的村
more
落。
and
所
more
以在这个时候，就必
convenient.
须
The
要
Earth has become
消
a
弭
true
狭隘
village.
思
We
维、
need
民粹
to
思想，
remove
培养
the
地球理解国
narrow-minded
际意识。
populism
那我们知
and to
道，法国的思
cultivate
想家莫莱专门提出
the
了一个叫地球主义的概
mentality
念。
of what
我
I
觉得这
call
个跟
an
我们习近平总
Earth
书记提出的人
Mother,
类命运共同
the
体
home
是
Earth. I
完
think
全一
that
致
is
的。
also
那所以我们
aligned
教
with
育既
what
要
President
培
Xi
养爱国
Jinping
主义的精神，
proposes
培
as
养
the
我
common
们
community of
传
shared
承
future for the
自
mankind.
身的优秀传统
And
文
so
化，
we need
同
to
时
encourage
更要理
what
解其他国
is
家、
valuable
其
in
他
our
民族的
own
文
culture,
化，
but
尊
at the
重文
same
明的
time, we
多
need to
样性，
respect and
尊重
understand
不同国家文化人
other
自己选择的道
diversities
路
and
和生活方式。
respect
那也就是更
the
为亲
choices
民、
made
更
by
为友好。
other
那么最
civilizations
后呢，就是
and
从学校中
cultures.
心走向
And
大学。
next
那
is
刚刚
from
任老教授也
schools
讲了这个问
to
题，就是我们传统教育完全
society.
是以学校为主。
And
但是其
Professor
实学
Linda
校的
Hammond
作
also
用，
said
是吧？那
the
么
traditional
在未
education
来，
system
实际上它
focuses
是
on
成
knowledge only,
我
but
们
in
不
the
能说它成
future,
为，但是
uh,
它仅仅依靠学校是完全解决不了教育的
schools
问题，
alone
是完全解决不
will
了
not
经
be
济发展的问题。
sufficient
因为现在已
to
经是
solve the
人人
problems
可
faced
学、
by
处处可学、时时可学的
education
一
and
个
learners
教育
because
资源泛滥化的时
knowledge
代。谢
is
谢大家，这是一个新的时代。
ubiquitous.
而
It's
且学校
anywhere
就
and
是
it's everywhere.
和
And
家庭社会的联动
um,
就起着非常重
the
要的作用。
linkage
那所以怎么
between
样处理好三者之间
schools
的关
and
系，
families
达到一
is
加一
very
加一大于
essential.
3的这样一
We
个效
need
果，
to
发
understand
挥家
how
庭和学校
school,
社会教育资源的作
family,
用，
and social
这也是
education
未来这
can
个教
be
育问题的关
leveraged
注的问题。
as synergy so
那
that
么最
one
后呢，
plus
简要的
one
介绍一
plus
下我们
one
新教育实验的
can
关于教育价值的一些思
produce
考和
results that are greater
看
than
法，
three.
是吧？
And
我们知
next
道
is the
这
fourth
个
chapter, which
其
would
实
be
我们这么多
explorations
年
and
来
the
一
thinking
直在
about
努
new
力的
education
观察
experiments. Well,
整个
for
世界
years
的
we
变
have
化和
been
教育的变化。
observing
我们一直在努力的探
changes
索
in education
新
in
的
the
教育
world.
形
We've been
态、
trying
新
to
的教育
think
内
about
容和新的教育
how
方式。
new education
刚刚也提到，
ecosystem
比
and
如说我们
content
倡导为
and
生命而教，
methods could be
拓展生命的长宽
redesigned.
高。比如
We
说我们倡导建设
are
数码社区，
discussing
培
how
养
to
学
build
生的
digital
信息
communities
意
so
识
that
和行动
students
能力。
can have a
比如
higher
说我们倡导
awareness
家校
and
合作共赢，
capabilities of
在建立
information. We
学校
talk
家
about
庭社会的
parent
学习共识体
teacher
比如说我们倡导不仅仅
co-education
仅教育
and the
培养人类
community
命运共同体
of
意识。
multiple
比如说我们
stakeholders
倡导
for the benefits
建立
of
新
the
的学习
learners.
中
And
心，
we often
构建
talk
从小
about
到和
new
睦的中层教育体系等
centers
等，是吧？那么这里呢，我想
being
重点
infused into
也讲
education
我们
so
做
that
的
the
几件
learning
工作。
itself
第
can
一呢，
truly be
我们
lifelong
还
from
是认
cradle to
为教
grave.
育的最
With
根本
several
的
things
目
that we
的
do,
是要
first, we think the
明确我们到
fundamental
底要做什么
mission
事。
of education
那
is
我
to
们新教
clarify
育部
what
是
we
叫
need
过
to
一种
do.
幸福
And
完
for
整的
new
教育生活，
education, we
是吧？
say
我觉得
it
这
is
是对教
a complete and happy life. Education is important, but the fundamental goal is for one to achieve self-realization so that we can become better selves. To achieve that goal, we need students who have flesh and blood to get engaged. They are not just passive utensils that receive objective information. We want students to feel happiness in this process. Well, as early as 2000, we proposed the concept of a happy education, which is similar to the flourish life mentioned by the father of positive psychology, Professor Seligman, in happiness 2.0 theory.
这
Well,
个可能
these two
有
concepts
很重
were
要的概念。
basically
那么其实
created
它也
at the
补充
same
了整个的
time,
教育
and
对于这
such
个幸福的这样一个关注的方
coincidence
式，是吧？那么积
also
极心理
point
学
out
发现
to
呢，
the
这
necessity of
个引
positivity
领人
in
生幸
life
福的5个
and the
要素，是
education
吧？积极的
and the
情绪体
positive
验，投
psychology
入的工作和生活，良好
determine
的人际关系，有
that
意义的
there
目标和成就感。
prescribes
那么这个呢，我
five
们在
determiners
新
of the
教育的
happiness in
4大
life.
行动以及新教育的
And
12个好
these
习惯中，
five
应该说也是
are
完
also
全
embedded
一致
into
的，
the
是吧？
10
这个是我们
action of a
新教育
new
实验的12个
education
好的习
um,
惯，是吧？那么这个跟
experiment.
积极
Well,
心理学
we
的这个深度价
propose
值的经验
12 good
优势分类，
habits,
大家可以
and
应
that
该
is
说
very
基
similar
本上
to
是
the
非常
categorization of
非常一致的，有很大的
Martin
关系。
Seligman and
那么
Christopher
同时呢，我
Peterson.
们新教育实验呢，把4大
At the
行动
same time,
怎么样
we
更好的落地吧，
really
也做了很多
implemented
很好
the
的探
10
索。
action, and
那么
lots
第
of
二是关于教师的引
experimentations
导，
have been made. And the
这
second
一
is
次
the
一旦
development
讲翻
of
译新教育一个很重要的
teachers.
原因，就是我们
Well,
探
we
索了
received the
教师
Yidan award
成
this
长的
time
非常重要的路径。
because
我们提出
we
了教师
found
成
new
长的
pathways
一个
for
职业认同
teacher
加专业发展
uh,
这样一个路
growth.
径。那我
So
们
we
认为从
think
教
a
师
teacher
怎么样能够
growth
更好的成长，
itself
从生命叙事的一个
should be
提
based
升，
on the two
应该
wings
以生命原
of
型，也就是他能够找
occupational
到自
recognition
己
and professional
这个成
development.
长
We
的
want the
这个
teachers to
生命的榜
really
样。第二，它更
identify
方便的
their
是
own
这个职
examples
业生
of
涯中的各种
growth.
遭
And
遇、各种
second,
困难、各种挑战，
for all the
是吧？第
setbacks
三
and
呢，怎么
challenges that
样
they
使用
encounter,
好
how
生
to
命
really
语
rise
言，
above.
是
And the
吧？
third is
那么
how to
这是
found
解决一个
the
认同的问
source
题。
of
那
motivation.
么其
And
次呢，
all
是
these
专业发
point
展，
to the
是吧？
problem
专业
of
发展呢，我们找到
recognition.
了专业阅
And
读、
next
专业
is
写
professional
作和专
development.
业
Well,
交往，
that it would be
那么专业交
professional
往的问题，
reading,
刚刚
writing,
说也
and
是我们领导
interactions.
也特别注重教
Linda
师成长的一个问
also
题。我曾经
valued
看到这
you know
个国内的这个
interactions
教
in
育
the
杂志采
community,
访
and we
这个琳达，那琳
see
达我认为中国
in a
教育的一个最
previous
大的
interview
特
of
点就是会教
Linda
研制度。其实教研
when
制度
she
里面
was
很重要的
interviewed
就
by
是
the
它的
Chinese
专业部
Education
分。
Journal.
那么
And
我们
then
新
she
教育
said,
要
you know,
抓
what
教师成
matters the
长的建
most
立专业沟
is
通力，以
to
及专
find
业阅
a
读和专业
system
写作的
and
一个应该
a
说有效的方式。
mechanism that could
这是
constantly
解决
motivate
教
all
师
the
职业倦
stakeholders
怠和专业
towards
发展
greater
应该说一
heights.
个比较好的
And
路径。
that is
因为教育的根本问
basically
题
the
到最
spirit
后
of
其
the
实还是
professional
教师。
interactions, because
那
education
任
all
不管
comes
教育怎么
down
变，那
to
么教
teachers,
师他的未来是
regardless
非常关键的。
changes in the
那么第三就
education
是课程的问
ecosystem,
题。
teachers
我们
will
一直认
always
为
remain.
课
Next
程
is that the
是整
integration
个
of
教育
the
的关键因素，
curriculum.
是
We
吧？
often
课程
say
的丰富性
curriculum
决
holds
定
the
了生命的
key
丰富性，
to
课
the
程的卓越
richness of
性
life
决定了生命的卓越
and
性，是吧？所
the
以
excellence
学什么
of
在学校里是非常重要的。 那
curriculum
么我们说的
determines the
传统
excellence
的
of
我
education.
我
But
提出
for
传
the
统的 school，
traditional
是吧？它应该让
schools,
位
as
于
I
这个
see it,
转变中吧，这
actually
个 learning hub， 是吧？每个
need
学
to be
习中心为了
transformed
更为
into
全面。
learning
最近
hubs,
呢，麦
and
克
the
劳希
learning
尔
hubs
出
are
版了
highly
一
personalized.
本新书，
Well,
叫
one of
Gift School。
my
我们应该说在这
books
个里面，
was
我们提出了新教育
recently
自己的未来课
published,
程概
which is
念。
called
那未来的
On
课程呢，
Future
我们就
Schools.
提出以生命教育作为基
And
础
we
课程。
believe
因为
life
教育是由
education
生命
should
而存
be
在的，
the
如果生命都没有了，教
most
育当
basic
然就
subject
没
in the
有
future curriculum.
存在的
Without
意义价
life
值。
being
那么在
recognized,
之
nothing
上，
makes
我们提
any
出以
sense
真
and
善
everything
美
fades
作
away.
为主干课
So
程，
the
是吧？
truth,
那么也就是我们新教育提出的大科
kindness,
学、
and
大人文，
beauty
是吧？
are
这
the
个
uh,
大德育、大艺术，
three
是吧？这样重建我
liberal
们的课程体系是非
and
常重要的。那么
general
刚刚琳达
dimensions
也提出了，就是
that
说我们
should
未来学
be
习的一些内容，包括
established
就
in
是
the
为情
future
感教
system.
育等
And
等。
Linda
其实在我们的
already
课程
talked
体系里
about
面，
how we
应该说
should
都是给予教授
achieve
关注。
integration of different
这
elements in
个
the education
这是
system.
我
And I
们
think
研发的
I
一套整个生命教育
cannot
的
agree
一套
more.
教学体
And
系。
so this is actually the
那么
system
最
of
后
the
呢，想
life
说一下关
education
于
of a
阅读
new
和写作的问题。 因
education
为
experiment. Lastly, I want to
新
talk
教
about
育实
reading
验
and
这
writing.
么多年来
For a
在
new
中国
education
的大陆，应
experiment,
该说一个
over the
很大的
years, we
推动力
really
就是
have have been the pioneer in driving on how reading and writing should be made the priorities in teaching, and that is really what we believe, because the reading is probably the fundamental issue in education. Well, in the past, we talk about calculating a small on top of a reading and writing. Well, of course, they form the cornerstone of education even in present day, where reading is the most important pillar for one's mental development. It is is for individuals, but also for society and nations. I saw the core knowledge movements founders cards book, who also holds that what creates education inequality in the United States is that in the fundamental stage of education, namely the primary school, certain resources are missing and certain cohorts are deprived of resources. And I think the equality of education is closely correlated to the equality of reading. If families of more challenged backgrounds can provide the young learners education resources such as books, even picture books, for them to read, that could help bridge the gap. And next, I think reading is also in line with reflection, and reflection can truly be nurtured through writing, and that's what we've been exploring in the past decades. And this year, our theme is beautiful life through beautiful writing. So new an experiment since it was established in 20 years. We are on the same wavelength with education for reform in China and abroad. So we really would like to thank the time that we live in, and I'm very grateful that we can have all the imaginations about education, innovation, and reform, and we can really execute what we imagine and try to envision. And once again, I would like to thank the Yidan Foundation for the award, and thank you all. Thank you, Professor Zhu.
We are very grateful for his support. Let me now move quickly to our questions. I hope I can ask 2 or 3 questions. The first one is, to be honest, I prepared this very, very carefully. The first one is, at present, both countries, United States and China, and arguably globally, we face even bigger and bigger dilemmas and gaps between, say, theory and practice, the mainstream and the marginal, local versus global orientation. Based on your research and observation, and this was touched already by both, and particularly by Professor Zhu. Based on your research and observation, could you please comment on these difficulties and challenges we are facing? How applicable is your experience, including both successful ones and not so successful ones? For you both, thank you.
That's a very big question. Professor Xu, would you like to start?
Linda, please, you're first. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I think that, the world is full of contradictions right now.
Yeah.
And on the one hand, there are a lot of barriers, and there are, on the one hand, we're trying to really respond to all of the challenges of the pandemic and the many, many challenges that Professor Xu outlined, which was wonderful. I thank you for the English subtitles. That was very helpful to me. And I totally agree that we're, facing this moment in our history where, really the survival of the species depends on the way in which we think about education. And at the same time, our schools are very challenged. Our teachers are very challenged. There's a lot of stress. There's a lot of anxiety in the system. And on the third hand, there are people inventing new ways of doing things. And there's much more receptivity in many, many communities to thinking about school in much more holistic ways than we might have thought about it in the past. So I see some new systems being transformed in the United States. I chair the Board of Education in California with a very visionary governor, and we are very actively incorporating new modalities of education, adding, early childhood, dealing with climate change, both in the state and in our curriculum, dealing with the ways in which we're rethinking everything from curriculum to examinations. And so that is happening in a very transformative way. The system, of course, has a lot of adjusting to do. And then I see other places in the United States where there's a very regressive impulse to, hold things back and to undermine public education. So we've got all of those things happening at the same time. And I think that's the nature of this moment in disruptive change. And you see that at every time in history where we've had these kinds of moments, that you get big forces that are, really contending with each other. And it's up to us how we lean in and how we support the movement forward for, our young people as well as our older people in experiencing an education that enables them to transform the possibilities that we're confronted with.
Thank you, Linda. 杜老师。
好 ，OK， 感谢 Linda。其实我觉得这是一个非常重要的问题，因为我们面对的这样一个大的问题，其实跟学校是有着非常密切的关系。因为所有的
The
问题都是
challenges we
人
face
造出来的。
today are
那我
closely
们这样的人
related
在
to
未来，他有
schools.
什么样的胸怀，有什么样
Problems
的
are
格
sometimes
局，
created
有
by
什么样的
schools.
行为方式，
What
会
kind
直
of
接影响
mindset
到
should
未
one
来
have
的
in
社
the
会的发展。
future?
所以的
I
确，
think
我们中国现在
that
也有很多学校。
will
那天我专门
affect
跟陈建明
the
先生介
fate
绍，
of the
在
world.
进行了第一探学校的
When I
探
talked to
索，
Professor
但是它还没
Chinkami,
有成为一
we
个必修课程，
already
能够成为一
discussed
个教育的
how
这个
curriculum
必须的内容，
should
是吧？那么
transform.
所以学校的
There
低
are
碳化，
topics that
培
should
养
be
孩子
made
们
mandatory.
低
For
碳生活，
example, the
培
low
养孩子
carbon
们有这样一个
lifestyle,
强烈的意识，
green
这是很关
lifestyle.
键的。包括人类命运
Awareness
共同体
needs
的
to
意识，
be
我
infused
们怎么
into
样进行爱
students'
国主
life
义
from
教
an
育？
early
像
time.
这样的
And also
问题是很重要的。
patriotism.
那有些国家的领导人就
How
强
should
调
that
我们国家
be
利益第一位，
incorporated
是吧？
into school curriculum?
是吧？那
What
么
some countries
我们从
believe
习近平先生他
um,
强调要有
that
人类命运共同体，
well,
这
for
就是两
example,
种格
China
局，两种胸怀。
has
那么我们培养
um,
我们的学生应该具有什
one
么样的胸怀？
important
我们在学
philosophy
校里怎么样进
proposed
行
by
国际
President
理
Xi
解教
Jinping,
育？
which is the common
我
community
们
of a
在
shared
让学
future
生
for
学
the
外，但
mankind.
并没有真正的
But
学习
how can
国际
that
理解教育。
be
所
taught
以这
as
样一种
awareness of the
和平的
students?
精神，这样一种人类
How
地
can
球祖
peace
国的
be
胸怀，我
taught?
觉得
And
也是
how
应该在学校里
can
面就
we
应该播
teach
下
the
种子。
students to
所有的
elevate
善的
their
种子
mindset to
都
the
是在学
level
校播下。
that goes
所以
beyond
你在学校
what
播下什
country's
么样的种
borders,
子，
but
未
rather
来
to
我们就会
include
收获什么样的人。
other
所以我觉
civilizations
得
and
的确，
cultures. And what we
看
see
来这
is
些
what we
好像很遥
harvest
远和
tomorrow.
宏观的这些大问题，其实
There
都和
are a
我们
lot
的
of
教师有
grandiose
非常
topics that
密
we
切的关
discuss,
系。
but
我
most
们
of
在
them
教
are
室里
closely
对孩子，
related to
我们和
teachers.
孩子
What
们
are
去
teachers
研究什么
giving
样的问
to
题，关注
students
什么
in
样的问题。
schools?
我们是
What
仅仅关注
are the
分数，
students
还是
guided
关
to
注
focus
人
on?
类，是吧？
Scores
这是
or
两
the
种不
mankind?
同的教育方式。所
These
以
are
我
two
觉得我们的
completely different
一种教
approaches.
育还是应
And
该
I think education
这个关注人类的
should
大问题，对吧？这样才能真正的让我们的教育能够更
look
美好，
at
也才能
the
让我们的
big
人类
topics and the
更
big
长远。
picture. Only that we can
对，
mankind
周老师讲的非常好。
embrace
就
a
这
better
个问题
tomorrow.
来讲，一
Thank you
方
very
面是
much.
很
Very
大的
beautifully
国际的，
said.
一方面实际上
On the one
是
hand,
跟他
it's
日常
about
生活中
international,
每
and the
天的
second, it is about
当时当地是紧密
you
结合
know
在一起。
the everyday life
嗯
of ours.
嗯，这当然对于老师要有很高的
And
要求。
for
我
teachers,
想问
that
，the
poses
next question
higher
I want to
requirements.
ask
My next
is
question
in
is
Chinese 守护与变革的问题。Let me again use English. And nowadays, when we talk about education, especially education for future, we emphasize change and transformation. I have no question about that. I think that's fine. To achieve that, we emphasize certain attitudes, qualities, and skills, even 21st century skills. People talk about that a lot. I think that's okay. That's surely okay. But I really want to play, to some extent, a devil's advocate here, by asking, are we doing all right? And is this in the right direction? Do we have anything to hold, 守护, or to keep? If we do not know what to keep, are we just like free-floating rootless duckweeds, 就是水上漂的浮萍随风飘了。如果我们没有个根的话，那么 then what are we, where are we moving? So in other words, how do we strike a balance between change and continuity in this vibrant, turbulent, and ever-changing world? Could you please share with us your thought?
Well, to me, it seems like the I talked about some principles of school design. And those are places for continuity. They're things that we know matter in the development of human learning and the development of the human being and in all of our various, areas of development. So we need to have, now we might change the way we do some of these things, but we need to have environments in which there are strong developmental relationships, in which there are adults and children. Now we might change the way we do that, but that's we need that continuity. And where we haven't achieved designs that are providing those developmental relationships, we need to accomplish those. We need to create environments in which there are opportunities for supportive and structured inquiry, where children get to ask and answer questions that are important and meaningful and connected to the environment around them that they are trying to understand. So, we might end up with more interdisciplinary learning, but we're going to need to build that on the foundations of the, big ideas that undergird the disciplines, which are the ways of thinking and learning material that come together. So I think there's change with continuity if you understand the underlying principles that we need to accomplish. We need to continue to build environments that allow for a sense of belonging and a sense of safety that may appear in different ways, but we need to preserve that principle. We need to help people develop social and emotional skills and supports. We may do that in ways that take advantage of different ways of organizing people, different ways of having experiential learning, different ways of using technology. But those features, I think, need to be continuous because they are the things that human beings need to be productive citizens and learners.
Yeah, Linda, I agree. But the China situation, and together with China, many non-Western societies, and particularly those with colonial history, the situation is very different. The curriculum, the formal knowledge in these societies, including China, does not link naturally to the tradition, actually link to something from outside. And that has been a huge challenge for us, We want to have both, of course, modernity and tradition, but it is not easy to have both. So with that, I really want to hear. Sorry, Linda, please.
Let me just say that, one of the things that's part of the way we learn is that we have to always be connected to the cultural context within which we're learning. And that is often not present in many schools. And I think that's the problem that you're identifying. But it is, one of the things that is a principle to strive for. And it is, I get that. I get how, and that's a problem in the United States too.
Oh.
We're also a colony.
Yeah. 朱老师 ，Yeah.
好，这个我觉得传统和变革啊，它一直是教育的这个张力所在。那也就是你
The tension of education is always between tradition and modernity.
肯定要变，因为你比如说
Time is changing, education must change.
农业社会的背景之下。
The traditional education is based on agrarian society where there were more certainties because agriculture was dependent on weather and climate. But in a new world with so many uncertainties, we need to be ready for uncertainties. The society is becoming from simple to complex structure, and these profound changes require us to have analytical, independent, critical thinking skills and problem-solving skills. But things such as reading remain the same, and these are what we need to keep. From ancient to present times, reading has always been a very important intermediary of learning. But reading now also is different because we have the internet. And after internet emerged, the information on the internet is a challenge. And how do we keep the tradition while adapting to the internet society, where the styles of reading must also change accordingly? So education is always trying to keep the essence of from the tradition while scraping what is outdated and update itself in order to keep pace with the time. Well, in the past 2 decades, new education experiment has been thinking about precisely just these questions. We try to preserve the essence from traditional Chinese culture. And we just developed one set of a system for the virtual learning of traditional Chinese culture. So traditional Chinese culture can be learned in a virtual manner. We already launched 6 subjects. The seventh one will be launched very soon. So that helps us to strike a balance between the inheritance of traditional essence and the creation of future-facing pathways. Education is about cultivating talents for the future. We need to think about both the past and the future, as well as the present. Presence is matters because education is a way of living. Students need to enjoy education as a way of living. Most importantly, we need to think about what is needed by the future society, what is required from education, and the biggest change of education is like what I said in my book. The educational institutions are no longer fitting for the future needs. The whole learning should be placed in a different premise from schools because schools are no longer adequate. Yet, we have not established any ecosystem that could link schools, families, and society so that education can combine virtual and physical, and it can combine theory and practice. And so I think we can look at banking sector. Throughout one's life, a person should be, you know, has an account for learning, and everything that this person learns is reflected on the balance of this account. We no longer need diplomas and degrees. There was a book from the US about why schools are still wasting all the time and money. It was written by economists from the United States. And the book said, now learning is geared towards degrees and diplomas a meaningless piece of paper. But should we actually rethink the diploma system? Can diploma really represent one's capabilities? And if these things don't change, if we don't change the assessment system, the school system, and the ways and means that we accredit one's learning, there will not be fundamental change of education. Our priority is to form consensus on how education institutions should be changed. I think that is a big problem. Well, Linda focuses on learning policies, which are more about individual capabilities of learning, but without the education institutions actually making changes, everything else will.
Yeah, 谢谢朱老师 Well said and agreed. I'm aware of the time. We are already after 10:30 Hong Kong time. Can I just briefly, finally ask you, each of you, to say one or two sentences
非常
to
感谢
our
现在我
audience
们请
as a
两
message
位
to
这
our
时间有限，已经
audience.
10点半了，跟观众分享1到2句话，从 Linda 开始，作为今天这个圆桌对话的结语。
The thing I'd like to say is that we are, we're at this inflection point, and it causes a lot of, it can cause people to feel a sense of anxiety and paralysis when they see so much change around. And I think it's a time at which we need to, if we're in a policy role or if we're in a practitioner role. It's a time in which we need to be thinking about the human condition, thinking about what it means to be a human being, what it means to be actualizing in that space, to be forgiving to each other, and to be able to think differently about our role in the system as not being an implementer of the designs that, you know, have been developed for us, and being holding in our hands the possibility for more human actualization in this moment, and to do that with a kind of trust and faith that if we do that together, we will be able to make the transitions that are needed to both support our the children that we work with, the teachers that we work with, and the world that we want to preserve for each other.
Thank you. 朱老师。
好，我用一句话呢，我说我们应该用更美好的教育，创
We
造一个
should
更美好的
use
地
better
球
education
和更美好
to
的
create
世
a
界，
better
让
earth
人
and a
类
better world
拥有一个更
so
美好的
that
未来。
the mankind enjoy a better future. Thank you. Very beautifully said. Thank you, Professor Zhu.
That's the end of this dialogue section. Can I please, on behalf of the forum, express our heartfelt thanks. We wish we had more time, but we don't. And so we hope in the future we can have more interactions. To express our heartfelt thanks, our appreciation, and our gratitude to you both. And also wish you all the best and good health. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.